A simple meal can change everything. Get ready for a story of transformation and gratitude like you've never seen before. What will a millionaire do the next day? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss incredible stories like this one. At 42, Jeremy had amassed more wealth than most people could dream of in several lifetimes. His investment firm, Thornton Capital, managed billions in assets, and his personal fortune had long since passed the point where numbers held any real meaning. Yet each morning, he woke to the same emptiness, a void that no amount of money seemed able to fill. The house staff moved like ghosts through the corridors, trained to be invisible unless needed. Jeremy preferred it this way, or at least, that's what he'd convinced himself over the years. Relationships were messy, complicated things that inevitably led to disappointment. He learned that lesson early in life, watching his parents' marriage crumble under the weight of his father's ambition and his mother's resentment. His morning routine was a masterpiece of efficiency. A precisely timed workout in his private gym, a breakfast prepared to exacting specifications, and a wardrobe selected by his personal stylist. Everything in his life was curated, controlled, and utterly devoid of spontaneity. That particular morning, however, something felt different. As he adjusted his perfectly knotted tie in the mirror, Jeremy caught sight of his own reflection. Really saw it, for the first time in years. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and there was a hardness to his expression that he didn't remember acquiring. When had he become this person, this hollow shell of success? Breaking from his usual routine, Jeremy decided to walk through downtown Los Angeles instead of taking his chauffeur-driven Tesla. He told himself it was about getting some exercise, but deep down, he knew he was searching for something, though he couldn't have said what. The streets were alive with the energy he rarely noticed from behind tinted windows. Street vendors called out their wares, tourists snapped photos, and business people hurried past with their eyes glued to their phones. Jeremy felt like an alien observer, watching a world he could see but never quite touch. As he walked, the sky began to darken ominously. He'd been so lost in thought that he'd wandered far from his usual thoughts, finding himself in a part of the city he barely recognized. The first fat drops of rain began to fall just as thunder rolled overhead, and suddenly the streets were chaos as people rushed for cover. Jeremy looked around for shelter, his $1,000 suit already beginning to soak through. That's when he saw them. A small group of people huddled under the awning of what looked like an abandoned storefront. They were running from the rain. They were queuing for something. At the center of the group stood a woman with warm brown eyes and a weathered face that spoke of both hardship and joy. She was ladling soup from a large pot into disposable cups, chatting and laughing with each person as if they were old friends. Despite the rain, despite the cold, despite the obvious poverty of her surroundings, she radiated a contentment that stopped Jeremy in his tracks. Their eyes met across the square, and before he could look away, she was waving him over. "You're soaked," she called out, her voice carrying easily over the sound of the rain. "Come get some soup before you catch your death." Jeremy's first instinct was to decline, to retreat to the familiar comfort of his controlled environment. But something in her smile, in the easy way she treated everyone around her, made his feet move forward instead of back. "I'm Angela," she said, holding out a steaming cup, "and you look like you could use this more than an umbrella right now." The cup was cheap plastic, nothing like the fine bone china he was accustomed to. The soup inside was simple, vegetable and bean, he guessed. But as the warmth spread through his cold hands and the steam rose to his face, Jeremy felt something shift inside her. Here, in this unlikely moment, drenched by rain and surrounded by strangers, he felt seen in a way that all his wealth and power had never managed to achieve. In her small apartment above a family-owned Vietnamese restaurant, Angela Martinez couldn't stop thinking about the man in the expensive suit who'd shown up at her soup kitchen in the rain. There had been something in his eyes, a loneliness that all the designer clothes in the world couldn't hide. She'd seen that look before, in the faces of the people she served every day, though usually it came wrapped in threadbare jackets rather than tailored wool. The apartment was modest but worn, filled with mismatched furniture and the lingering sense of the spices she used in her cooking. Photos covered one wall, faces of people she'd helped over the years, many of whom still stopped by to share their success stories or simply to chat. Angela believed in the power of food to heal more than just hunger, and every picture represented a connection forged over a simple bowl of soup. She moved through her evening routine, washing dishes while her ancient radio played soft jazz. The mysterious man's expression stayed with her, that look of surprise when she handed him the soup, as if no one had offered him simple kindness in years. In her experience, the wealthiest often turned out to be the poorest in spirit. Meanwhile, across town, Jeremy sat in his home office, his rain-soaked suit replaced with casual wear that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The taste of Angela's soup lingered in his memory, along with the warmth of her smile. He found himself opening his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing Angela Martinez Los Angeles Community Service into the search bar. The results painted a picture that both impressed and humbled him. Local news articles spoke of her work feeding the homeless, organizing community gardens, and running cooking classes for at-risk youth. She operated on a shoestring budget, using donated ingredients and her own savings to keep the program running. One article mentioned how she'd started the initiative after losing her restaurant to a fire, choosing to see the tragedy as an opportunity to serve others rather than bitter defeat. Jeremy leaned back in his custom leather chair, thinking about his own path to success. He remembered the early days, sleeping on friends' couches, eating ramen noodles between trading sessions. But even at his lowest, he'd never known true hunger, never experienced the kind of desperation he'd seen in the eyes of some of Angela's guests. The next morning, instead of heading to his office, Jeremy found himself driving back to the square where he'd met Angela. He told himself he was just being a responsible citizen, that someone with his resources had an obligation to support worthwhile causes. But deep down, he knew there was more to it than that. He found her setting up for the day's service, organizing volunteers, and directing the placement of folding tables with the efficiency of a seasoned commander. She looked up as he approached, recognition flickering across her face. "Well, well," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Our man in the fancy suit returns. Though I see you dressed more practically today." Jeremy glanced down at his casual outfit. Still designer, but less conspicuous than yesterday's suit. "I wanted to make a donation," he said, reaching for his wallet. "Your work here is impressive." Angela's smile never wavered, but she shook her head. "That's very kind, but we don't accept individual donations without proper paperwork and transparency. Too many people try to use charity as a tax write-off, or a way to feel better about themselves. If you want to help, we always need volunteers." The rejection of his money, something that usually opened any door he wanted, caught Jeremy off guard. But rather than feeling offended, he found himself intrigued. Here was someone who cared more about genuine involvement than financial gain, who saw value in things his wealth couldn't buy. As he watched her work, coordinating volunteers and greeting regulars by name, Jeremy began to understand that Angela's real wealth lay in the connections she'd built, in the community she created out of nothing but compassion and determination. It was a kind of richness he'd never considered before, one that made his own achievements feel suddenly hollow. Standing there in the morning light, watching Angela coordinate her volunteer efforts, Jeremy felt something stir within him, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his earliest days of building his empire. It was the feeling of possibility, of standing on the precipice of something meaningful. The way Angela moved through the crowd, touching lives with nothing more than a bowl of soup and genuine care, made his own achievements feel like entries in a ledger, numerically impressive but ultimately hollow. He found himself lingering, observing the intricate dance of community service. A young mother with 2 children received not just food, but also a warm hug and information about job training programs. An elderly man, his clothes threadbare but clean, shared stories of his grandchildren, while Angela listened with genuine interest. Each interaction was more than a simple transaction. It was a thread in a tapestry of human connection that grew richer with every passing moment. As the morning wore on, Jeremy's expensive watch went unchecked, a first for him in years. Instead, he found himself drawn into conversations with volunteers, learning their stories. There was Maria, a former recipient of Angela's help who now owned a small cleaning business and spent every Thursday morning giving back. Thomas, a retired high school teacher who taught basic computer skills to anyone interested. Using laptops he'd repaired himself. Each person carried a story of transformation, of lives touched and changed by this remarkable woman's vision. The property he owned just 3 blocks away kept floating through his thoughts. It was a substantial building he'd acquired years ago as part of a larger real estate deal, left to gather dust while he waited for property values to rise enough to make renovation worthwhile. Now, looking at Angela's makeshift operation, the folding tables that had to be set up and taken down daily, the portable stoves that struggled to keep soup warm, the lack of proper shelter for those waiting in line, he began to see the building with new eyes. During a quiet moment, as Angela was organizing donations in the back of her worn-out van, Jeremy approached her again. This time, he wasn't reaching for his wallet. "I've been thinking," he began, trying to keep his voice casual despite the unexpected nervousness he felt. "Your operation here is impressive, but you could help more people with a proper facility." Angela looked up from her inventory list, a skeptical expression crossing her face. "We do what we can with what we have," she replied, her tone gentle but firm. "Dreams are free, but buildings and loss, Angela saw it. What if they could be?" Jeremy found himself saying. The words tumbled out before he could second-guess them. "I have a property, nothing fancy, but solid. 3 blocks from here. It's just sitting empty, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with it." Angela's expression shifted from skepticism to curiosity. "That old warehouse on Mason Street? The blue one?" When Jeremy nodded, she continued, "I pass it every day. Such a waste of good space in a neighborhood that needs help." "I'd like you to see it," Jeremy said, surprising himself with how much he wanted her to say yes. Not as a donation, not yet. Just as a possibility. The morning sun caught the silver threads in Angela's dark hair as she considered his offer. Around them, the usual buzz of activity continued. Volunteers cleaning up, late arrivals hoping for a meal, regulars chatting in small groups. It was a scene of organized chaos, of humanity in all its messy glory, so different from the sterile perfection of Jeremy's usual world. "Why?" Angela asked finally, her brown eyes searching his face. "Why would a man in a $1,000 casual outfit suddenly want to help a soup kitchen?" Jeremy looked around at the community Angela had built, at the lives being changed one bowl of soup at a time. "Because yesterday, in the rain, you didn't see a wealthy man who could help your cause. You just saw someone who needed soup." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I've spent my life building wealth, Angela, but standing here, watching what you've built with nothing but compassion and determination, I'm starting to think I've been measuring success with the wrong metrics." A small smile tugged at the corners of Angela's mouth. "Metrics," she repeated, shaking her head. "You sound like my brother. He's an accountant, always talking about measurable outcomes. But you can't measure the value of hope, Mr. Thornton," he supplied. "Jeremy Thornton. And no, you can't measure hope, but you can give it room to grow." The activity around them began to wind down as the lunch hour passed. Volunteers were packing up the last of the equipment, and the crowd had thinned to a few regulars who helped with cleanup in exchange for extra portions to take home. Angela watched them work, her expression thoughtful. "Tomorrow morning," she said finally, 8 a.m. "I have to see the space before the lunch service starts." Jeremy nodded, trying to contain his unexpected excitement. "I'll have the keys and meet you there." "And Angela?" She looked up at him questioningly. "Thank you for the soup yesterday. It was exactly what I needed." As he walked back to his car, Jeremy pulled out his phone to cancel his morning meetings. Something he'd never done without a major crisis looming. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was heading towards something important, rather than running from the emptiness that had become his constant companion. The warehouse key felt heavy in his pocket, weighted with possibility. He'd owned the building for 5 years without giving it more than a passing thought, seeing it only as a number in his portfolio. Now, he could picture it transformed: windows letting in natural light, proper kitchen facilities, space for training programs and community gatherings. Not just a soup kitchen, but a place of real transformation. That evening, instead of heading home to his quiet mansion, Jeremy found himself driving past the warehouse. He parked across the street, studying the building in the fading light. The graffiti-covered walls and boarded-up windows would have normally made him think only of property values and renovation costs, Instead, he found himself wondering about the stories of the people who might find hope within those walls. His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, questions about tomorrow's canceled meetings, reminders about pending decisions, the usual urgent but not important matters that filled his days. For the first time, he let them go unanswered. Instead, he opened his laptop and began researching community centers, soup kitchens, and job training programs. As the street lights flickered on and the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm, Jeremy Thornton, the man who had everything, began to imagine a different kind of wealth, one measured not in dollars, but in lives changed and hope restored. The sound of laughter drew his attention to the street, where he saw the group of teenagers walking past, sharing something from a paper bag, probably leftovers from Angela's lunch service. They moved with the easy camaraderie of people who had nothing to prove to each other, their joy unrestrained by self-consciousness. When was the last time he had laughed like that? When was the last time he had friends who knew him as just Jeremy, not as the CEO of Thornton Capital? As night fell completely, Jeremy remained in his car, watching the ebb and flow of neighborhood life. A woman walked past with groceries, stopping to chat with an elderly man sweeping his storefront. A group of workers trudged home from the bus stop, tired but exchanging friendly nods with neighbors. This wasn't the polished, pristine world he usually inhabited, but there was an authenticity here that made his gated community feel artificial in comparison. His thoughts kept returning to Angela's question, why? Why was he really doing this? The answer that had come to his lips had been true, but perhaps not complete. Watching the last stragglers of the day make their way home, Jeremy admitted to himself what he'd been avoiding. He was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely, and somehow, in the simple act of being handed a cup of soup, he'd felt more connected to humanity than he had in years. Tomorrow, he would show Angela the warehouse. Tomorrow, he would take the first step towards something new. But tonight, sitting in his luxury car on a quiet street in a neighborhood that would have made his wealth managers cringe, Jeremy Thornton felt more alive than he had in decades. The emptiness that had been his constant companion began to feel less like a void and more like a space waiting to be filled, not with things, but with purpose. That sense of purpose carried Jeremy through a sleepless night, his mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in years, he skipped his rigidly scheduled morning workout, instead arriving at the warehouse an hour early. The pre-dawn light cast long shadows across the building's facade, and he found himself pacing the sidewalk, checking his watch every few minutes like a nervous teenager before a first date. At precisely 8 o'clock, Angela's weathered van pulled up to the curb. She emerged wearing the same practical clothes as yesterday, her hair tied back in a simple knot, carrying a thermos that filled the morning air with the rich aroma of coffee. "You're early," she observed, offering him a cup. The coffee was strong and sweet, nothing like the artisanal brew his personal barista prepared each morning, but somehow more satisfying. "Couldn't sleep," Jeremy admitted, fumbling with the keys. The lock stuck slightly, partly surprising given how long it had been since anyone had used it. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous space filled with shadows and possibility. Jeremy reached for the light switch, praying the electricity was still connected. To his relief, industrial fluorescent lights flickered to life, revealing the warehouse in all its neglected potential. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through the high windows. The space was vast, easily 5 times the size of Angela's current operation. The concrete floors were solid despite years of disuse, and the ceiling soared 2 stories high. Metal stairs led to a mezzanine level that wrapped around 3 sides of the building. Angela moved through the space slowly, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Her expression was unreadable as she ran her hand along a wall, tested the strength of the stairs, peered into the small offices that lined one side of the building. Jeremy found himself holding his breath, watching her reaction with an intensity that surprised him. "The plumbing probably needs work," she said finally, her voice neutral, "and the electrical system would need to be upgraded for industrial kitchen equipment." "All fixable," Jeremy replied quickly, too quickly perhaps, betraying his eagerness. "The building's structurally sound. I had it inspected last year when I was considering selling it." Angela turned to face him, her expression serious. Why aren't you selling it? This location, this much space, you could make a fortune turning it into luxury lofts. The question caught him off guard. Why wasn't he selling? The answer that came to him was surprisingly simple. Because money isn't always the best measure of value. She studied him for a long moment, then walked to one of the high windows, wiping away years of grime with her sleeve to peer out at the neighborhood awakening below. Do you know what I see when I look at this space, Mr. Thornton? Jeremy, he corrected automatically. And I hope you see what I see, potential. I see more than that, Angela said softly. I see a commercial kitchen where we could not only feed people but teach them culinary skills. I see classrooms where we could offer job training and GED programs. I see a daycare center so single parents can attend those classes. I see medical professionals volunteering their time in those office spaces, offering basic care to people who can't afford it. She turned back to him, her eyes bright with possibility. I see a place where people could find not just a meal, but a path forward. Jeremy felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Then why are we still just looking at it? The building is yours, Angela. No strings attached. She shook her head, and his heart sank momentarily before she spoke again. Not mine. Ours. If you're serious about this, really serious, then be part of it. Not just as a donor, but as a partner. These people don't need another charitable foundation that hands out help from a distance. They need to see that someone like you, someone who represents the success they dream of, believes in them enough to work alongside them. The proposition hung in the air between them, challenging everything Jeremy had built his life around. His carefully constructed walls of isolation trembled at the very thought of such involvement. It would mean stepping out of his comfortable role as a distant benefactor, becoming personally invested in the messy, complicated lives of real people. But standing there in the dusty morning light, looking at the hope in Angela's eyes and the vastness of the space around them, Jeremy felt something shift inside him. The emptiness that had driven him to walk in the rain 2 days ago suddenly felt less like a void and more like an open door, inviting him towards something real and meaningful. I don't know the first thing about running a community center, he admitted. Angela's smile was warm and knowing. And I don't know the first thing about building permits, contractor negotiations, or navigating city bureaucracy. But something tells me you do. She was right, of course. These were problems he knew how to solve, challenges he could meet with the same skills he'd used to build his fortune. But this time, the end result wouldn't be another zero in his bank account. It would be real change in real people's lives. When do we start? He asked, surprised by the eagerness in his own voice. Angela checked her watch. I have soup to serve in 2 hours. Why don't you join us? Really join us. Help cook, help serve, learn the names and stories of the people we'll be helping here. Because that's what this is really about, Jeremy. Not the building, not the programs, but the people. As they walked back to their vehicles, Jeremy found himself looking at the warehouse with new eyes. The graffiti-covered walls now seemed like blank canvases waiting for expression. The empty space felt full of whispered possibilities. Even the neighborhood seemed different. Not a depressed area waiting for gentrification, but a community waiting for opportunity. Oh, and Jeremy? Angela called as she climbed into her van. We're something you don't mind getting dirty. My kitchen isn't quite as pristine as this place will be. He watched her drive away, then looked down at his casual but still designer clothes. For the first time in years, Jeremy Thornton laughed out loud, the sound echoing off the warehouse walls like a promise of things to come. He had exactly 2 hours to go home, change, and figure out how to chop vegetables without embarrassing himself completely. As he drove home, his phone began its usual morning symphony of notifications. Emails demanding attention, meetings requiring confirmation, decisions waiting to be made. But for once, these urgent matters felt less important than learning how to dice an onion properly. The empire he'd built would have to wait. Today, he had soup to make. The morning traffic parted before his luxury car as always, but Jeremy felt like a different person behind the wheel. The city looked different somehow, fuller, more alive with possibility. He found himself noticing details he'd overlooked for years. The elderly man carefully arranging flowers outside his tiny shop, the young mother hurrying her children to school, the street artist adding bright colors to a previously gray wall. These were the people Angela served. he realized. Not abstract statistics or tax deductions, but real people with stories and dreams and challenges. And somehow, impossibly, he was about to become part of those stories. The thought should have terrified him, and part of him was terrified. But mostly he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: anticipation,